At 3:02 a.m. on August 21st, 1942, Private Alfred Al Schmid crouched behind a Browning M1917A1 .30 caliber machine gun on the west bank of the Tenerife River on Guadalcanal. Across the water, in the darkness, 800 Japanese soldiers were moving into position. Schmid was 21 years old. He had been on the island 2 weeks. He had never fired his weapon in combat. 2 days after Pearl Harbor, he had walked out of a steel mill in Philadelphia and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. He trained at Parris Island, learned to operate the water-cooled Browning, and was assigned to Company H, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. Before the war, he had been an apprentice steel burner. Now he was a machine gun loader in the middle of the Pacific. His fighting position was a shallow pit reinforced with sandbags and coconut logs, concealed with palm fronds. 50 yards of shallow river separated him from the Japanese assembly area on the opposite bank. 2 other Marines shared the pit. Corporal Leroy Diamond handled ammunition and assisted with belt changes. Private First Class Johnny Rivers was the gunner. Rivers had trained on the Browning for 6 months. Diamond had field experience from stateside exercises. Schmid was the least experienced of the 3. His job was to feed 300-round cloth belts into the gun and keep the water jacket full, preventing the barrel from overheating. If the gun failed, they were finished. They were there because of Henderson Field. When the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th, the Japanese had been building an airstrip at Lunga Point. The Marines captured it half-finished and completed it themselves. Within days, Marine and Navy aircraft were flying combat missions from the field, striking Japanese positions across the Solomon Islands. Henderson Field was the first American offensive foothold in the Pacific. If it fell, Guadalcanal fell. If Guadalcanal fell, the entire South Pacific was at risk. For 2 weeks after the landing, the Marines encountered little resistance. Japanese forces withdrew into the jungle. Patrols found abandoned equipment, discarded supplies, but almost no enemy soldiers. Intelligence reports warned that the Japanese were regrouping. The Marines dug in. The Tenerife River, sometimes called the Ilu, was the most direct approach to Henderson Field from the east. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion held the sector. Rifle companies established overlapping fields of fire. Barbed wire was strung forward of the line. Machine gun positions were placed to cover every crossing point. Then, on August 18th, Marine scouts detected Japanese forces landing at Taivu Point, 22 miles east. The force was commanded by Colonel Kaineo Ichiki. Ichiki's detachment was elite, veterans of China and Manchuria. He believed the Marines were poorly trained and lacked resolve. He expected to break through their defenses and recapture Henderson Field within 48 hours. The Marines, meanwhile, were isolated. After the Battle of Savo Island on August 9th, where 4 Allied cruisers were sunk, the U.S. Navy pulled back. Supply convoys became irregular. Ammunition was finite. Medical stores were thin. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections were spreading through the ranks. Every Marine on Guadalcanal understood the truth. If the Japanese attacked in force, no help was coming. Before leaving Philadelphia, Schmid had written to his fiancée, Ruth Babs Hartley. They had met at the Dodge Steel Company, where she worked as a clerk. He had used his Christmas bonus to buy her an engagement ring. The ring was still in Pennsylvania. Schmid was in a foxhole in the jungle, waiting for 800 men to attack. Ichiki's troops had marched for 3 days through dense jungle without contact. He took the silence as confirmation of American weakness. He chose to attack immediately rather than wait for reinforcements. His plan was simple. A frontal assault across the Tenerife sandbar, break the Marine line, reach Henderson Field before dawn. At 3 a.m., green flares arced into the sky. The signal to attack. Schmid heard voices across the river, shouting, movement, metal clinking in the dark. The sound of hundreds of men forming for a charge. Rivers settled behind the Browning. Diamond fed the first belt. Schmid checked the water jacket. The gun was ready. The first wave emerged from the darkness. 50 Japanese soldiers, advancing shoulder to shoulder across the sandbar. More followed behind them. They fired rifles as they moved, screaming, trying to force the Marines to reveal their positions. Rivers waited. When the lead elements reached the center of the river, he opened fire. The Browning roared to life at 450 rounds per minute. Every 5th round was a tracer. Rivers swept left to right through the formation. Men fell. Others tripped over bodies and kept coming. The water turned dark beneath the muzzle flashes. The second wave hit the sandbar. Rivers cut them down before they could establish a foothold. Another Marine machine gun opened fire 150 yards downstream, creating overlapping fields of fire. Japanese soldiers caught between the two guns had nowhere to go. The sandbar offered no cover. Bodies piled up in the shallows. The third wave advanced over the dead. Officers shouted orders. Men were shoved forward at bayonet point. The Japanese believed momentum would carry them through. Schmid counted 8 separate waves in the first 30 minutes. Each was destroyed. The Browning ran flawlessly. No jams. No stoppages. Rivers fired with mechanical precision, short bursts, controlled traverse, constant adjustments. Diamond fed belts as fast as they were consumed. The barrel began to glow. Steam hissed from the water jacket. Schmid poured in water from canteens. It boiled instantly. The gun was approaching failure temperature, but Rivers did not slow. Then a grenade detonated near the adjacent machine gun position. That gun went silent. Now Rivers' crew was the only machine gun covering this section of the river. All enemy fire shifted to them. Bullets slammed into sandbags. Coconut logs splintered. One round punched through a gap and passed inches from Rivers' head. The volume of fire increased. More Japanese poured forward. Rivers adjusted his aim, firing into the densest concentrations. The barrel glowed red. The water jacket churned violently. Schmid kept pouring. The gun screamed. Then Schmid saw movement to the right. Shapes slipping through the trees. A flanking attempt. He grabbed his M1 Garand, fired 3 shots into the darkness. The movement vanished. He returned to the gun. Rivers was burning through ammunition at a rate that could not be sustained. And the Japanese were still coming. They had started the night with 2,000 rounds. By the time the assault was less than an hour old, half of it was gone. The Japanese changed tactics. Instead of massed waves, they began sending small assault groups, 10, 15 men at a time, spread across the width of the river. Harder to track, harder to suppress. Rivers was forced to engage multiple targets at once, shifting constantly, never letting the gun rest. The barrel temperature climbed. Schmid could feel heat radiating through the air. Metal expanded. Components warped microscopically under stress. The Browning was being driven past its design limits. Then a round punched through the water jacket. The bullet passed clean through the metal casing. Superheated water sprayed across Schmid's lap and chest. Steam erupted. The cooling system was gone. Rivers didn't stop firing. The barrel began to crackle, a sound Schmid had never heard in training. Metal under thermal stress, warning of imminent failure. Any second the gun could seize, rupture, or cook off ammunition in the chamber. It didn't. Diamond was hit next. A bullet tore through his left arm, shattering muscle and bone. He collapsed partially across Schmid's feet. Blood soaked into the sand. He tried to stand. Failed. Pulled himself upright against the back wall of the pit. He could no longer load belts. That job fell to Schmid. Rivers kept firing, now one-handed. Right hand locked on the trigger, left arm reaching back to guide the ammunition belt. Japanese soldiers continued crossing. The attack showed no sign of slowing. Colonel Achiki was committing everything. 800 men against a handful of Marines. The Japanese expected numbers to break resistance. They did not expect the machine gun to keep firing. At 3:41 a.m., 12 bullets struck Johnny Rivers in the face and neck. He died instantly. His finger remained locked on the trigger. The Browning fired 200 more rounds before his hand finally relaxed and slipped free. Smoke poured from the breech. The barrel was white-hot. Schmid shoved Rivers' body aside and slid into the gunner's position. He had never fired the Browning in combat. His hands found the grips. His thumbs found the trigger. He had watched Rivers operate the weapon for 40 minutes. Now it was his. The Japanese never paused during the transition. Schmid pressed the trigger. The Browning roared again. Tracers carved across the water. He felt the recoil slam into his shoulders. He traversed left. Fired. Traversed right. Fired again. His technique lacked Rivers' precision, but it worked. Men fell. Diamond, still conscious, dragged himself closer. With his uninjured arm, he fed belts into the weapon. When one ran dry, he tapped Schmid's shoulder. Stop. Open. Feed. Close. Fire. They fell into rhythm. Schmid's hands were burning. The grips were too hot to touch, but he ignored it. Pain didn't matter. The gun had to stay firing. Across the river, the Japanese were forming again. Hundreds of men massed on the far bank. Officers shouted orders. Schmid fired into the staging area, disrupting their assembly, buying minutes they desperately needed. The barrel glowed bright orange now. All coolant was gone. The metal was near structural failure. Schmid knew what that meant. The barrel could split. The receiver could crack. The gun could explode. He kept firing. Stopping meant being overrun. At 4:17 a.m., the largest assault yet came across the sandbar. More than 200 men. Schmid engaged them at maximum range. The Browning hammered without pause. Brass piled at his feet. The muzzle flash turned the river into a strobing nightmare. Japanese soldiers fell in clusters. Those behind climbed over bodies and kept coming, firing as they advanced. Bullets struck the sandbags like hail. Diamond fed belts mechanically, growing weaker from blood loss, but refusing to stop. The gun should have failed 10 minutes earlier. It didn't. The assault collapsed. Survivors fell back, leaving more than 70 dead on the sandbar. Schmid stopped firing for seconds. The barrel crackled as it cooled, stress fractures visible along its length. The next sustained burst might destroy it. More Japanese prepared to cross. They had lost 300 men. 500 remained. Ichiki did not withdraw. Schmid fired again. 20 men dropped in the first burst. Survivors scattered, went prone among the bodies, returned fire. The battle became a brutal exchange across 50 yards of river. Then one soldier crawled forward. He moved beneath the dead, stayed low, reached the water's edge directly in front of the muzzle flash. He pulled a Type 97 grenade and threw it flat. The grenade hit the top sandbag, bounced into the pit, landed beside Schmid's right knee. It detonated 2 seconds later. At 4:33 a.m., everything went white, then black. Shrapnel tore into Schmid's face. His left eye was destroyed instantly. His right eye was shredded. Blood filled both. He touched his face and felt torn flesh and wetness. The pain arrived a heartbeat later. He tried to open his eyes. Nothing. Total darkness. Diamond understood immediately. Schmid was blind. The Japanese were still attacking. Diamond spoke in short bursts, direction, distance. Schmid listened, processed, oriented the gun by sound and instruction. He pressed the trigger. The Browning fired. Diamond watched the tracers, corrected aim, struck Schmid's arm when he needed adjustment. Schmid traversed. Fired. Traversed again. They became a system. Blood ran down Schmid's face, soaked his collar, dripped onto ammunition belts. His left arm was going numb. His right arm still worked. That was enough. He kept firing. The Japanese noticed the change. The machine gun was still firing, but the rhythm was different. The sweeps were wider. The bursts less precise. The pauses irregular. To trained eyes across the river, it looked like weakness. They shifted men toward that sector. What they did not know was that the gunner was now completely blind. That the Browning was being aimed by spoken directions from a wounded Marine who could barely remain conscious. Schmid burned through another 300-round belt. Diamond fumbled with the next one. His movements were slower now. Blood loss was draining his strength. He dropped the belt once, forced his hand to work, got it seated, slapped Schmid's shoulder. Fire. The barrel was far beyond any safe operating temperature. It was deforming visibly, warping under heat. Accuracy degraded with every second, but at 50 yards, accuracy mattered less than volume. Japanese soldiers were piled 3 and 4 deep on the sandbar. The living had to climb over the dead to advance. That slowed them, made them vulnerable. Schmid fired at sound, at splashes, at shouted orders, at boots moving through shallow water, at rifles cracking from the far bank. The battlefield existed for him only as noise and vibration. Diamond's voice guided him, left, right, closer, farther, until the words themselves began to fade. By 5:02 a.m., Diamond's voice was weaker. Instructions came less often. Schmid relied on instinct now, sweeping the gun across the river, crossing by memory, firing into the densest concentrations of sound. The Japanese kept coming. Imperial Army doctrine did not allow retreat. The Browning began to come apart. Thermal stress fractures spread through the receiver. The bolts cycled irregularly. Spent casings failed to eject, jammed the mechanism. Schmid cleared malfunctions by touch, burned hands working red-hot metal in total darkness. Clear. Fire. Jam. Clear again. The weapon was disintegrating around him. Ammunition was nearly gone. They had started with 2,000 rounds. Perhaps 300 remained. Schmid shortened his bursts, conserved ammunition, stretched each belt as long as possible. Diamond was barely responsive now. Schmid made targeting decisions alone, aiming by sound, by memory of the riverbank, by sheer refusal to stop. At 5:38 a.m., the sky began to lighten. Schmid could not see dawn, but he could hear it. Fewer voices, less movement. The assault was losing momentum. The Japanese had been attacking for 2.5 hours. Colonel Ichiki watched his regiment collapse. He had committed nearly his entire force. The Marines had not broken. His men were dying by the hundreds on the sandbar and in the river. The water was choked with bodies. The far bank was littered with wounded crawling back toward the jungle. This was not victory. It was annihilation. At 6:15 a.m., the Japanese withdrew. Rifle fire faded. Shouting stopped. The battlefield fell silent. Schmid kept the Browning aimed at the river. His finger rested on the trigger. He waited for the next wave. It never came. Diamond was unconscious now. His breathing was shallow. Schmid could hear it, but he could not see him, could not treat him, could not even assess the wound. Schmid's own injuries burned constantly. His ruined eyes swelled shut. His left arm hung useless. Only his right arm still functioned. He sat and waited. Minutes passed. Then more. The silence was worse than the fight. During the battle, there had been purpose, fire, reload, survive. Now there was nothing to do but wait in darkness. Boots approached. American voices. Someone called out, identified themselves as friendly, ordered Schmid to hold fire. A corpsman climbed into the pit. He saw Rivers dead, Diamond unconscious and bleeding. Schmid sitting behind a destroyed machine gun, face soaked in blood. The corpsman treated Diamond first, tourniquet, morphine. Then he moved to Schmid. Asked questions. Schmid answered calmly. Told him he couldn't see. Told him about the grenade. The corpsman didn't comment on the damage. He just worked. Bandaged Schmid's face. Wrapped his arm. Gave morphine. Told him evacuation was coming. Officers arrived. They looked at the river. Counted bodies. The numbers were staggering. Dozens dead directly in front of this single position. Perhaps more than 100 within its field of fire. The river still ran red. The sandbar had vanished beneath corpses. Lieutenant Colonel Pollock came himself. He saw what 3 Marines had done. The destroyed Browning still smoking. Rivers dead. Diamond unconscious. Schmid blind, wounded, still at the gun. He understood immediately. Across the line, casualty counts rose. 200, then 400, then 600. Nearly 900 Japanese soldiers had been committed. Only a handful survived. Colonel Ichiki was found dead later. Reports said he had taken his own life after the defeat. Schmid was lifted onto a stretcher. He asked about Diamond. They said he would live. He asked about Rivers. They told him Rivers was dead. Schmid already knew. He had pushed Rivers' body aside to take the gun. But hearing it spoken made it final. The stretcher moved toward the aid station. Schmid could not see Henderson Field. Could not see the jungle. Could not see anything at all. Morphine dulled the pain, but not the reality. His face burned. His eyes felt filled with shattered glass. Doctors stabilized him, removed shrapnel they could reach, cleaned the wounds, administered antibiotics. Then they tagged him for immediate evacuation. For 3 days, he lay in a tent on Guadalcanal, blind, listening. Aircraft engines. Artillery fire. Japanese bombers overhead. The war continued. When the morphine loosened its grip, Schmid thought about the gun. He replayed the fight in fragments. Counted ammunition belts in his head. Tried to measure time without having seen a watch. Wondered how many minutes passed between Rivers' last burst and the grenade. Wondered if there had been a moment, any moment, where he could have done something different. There were no answers. Johnny Rivers was dead. That was the only fact that mattered. On August 24th, Schmid was lifted onto a transport aircraft and flown offshore to a hospital ship anchored beyond the range of Japanese artillery. The ship carried full surgical facilities, real operating rooms, real lighting, ophthalmologists trained specifically in combat eye injuries. They examined him carefully. The truth was worse than the field doctors had believed. His left eye was completely destroyed, irreparable. No chance. No procedure could restore it. His right eye was severely damaged, retinal trauma, corneal lacerations, deep inflammation. The surgeons operated immediately, attempting to preserve whatever vision might remain. Schmid woke from surgery still in darkness. The doctors were direct, honest. There were no comforting lies. The left eye was gone. The right eye might recover partial vision. Might. There were no guarantees. His military career was over. The life he had known before Guadalcanal was finished. In early September, the hospital ship transported him to San Diego Naval Hospital. He was placed in a ward with other Marines evacuated from Guadalcanal. Men missing limbs, men burned, men blinded. The hospital had protocols for cases like his: physical rehabilitation, psychological counseling, vocational preparation for life without sight. Recovery was slow. Surgeons performed multiple additional operations, removing embedded shrapnel the field surgeons had missed, reconstructing damaged facial tissue, grafting skin, cleaning infected wounds. Each procedure was followed by weeks of waiting, weeks of lying still, weeks of darkness. A Red Cross worker named Virginia Pfeiffer was assigned to him. She helped him navigate the hospital corridors, taught him how to orient himself without vision, read his mail aloud, wrote letters when his hands were too weak or bandaged. She understood something the doctors did not always see. Schmid needed more than medical care. He needed a reason to endure. Pfeiffer asked about his life before the war, his family, his job, and finally, his fiancée. Schmid told her about Ruth Hartley Babs, the woman he planned to marry, the ring he had bought with his Christmas bonus, the life that had been waiting in Philadelphia before Guadalcanal took it apart. Pfeiffer obtained Ruth's address from Schmid's records and began writing to her herself. She explained the injuries honestly, the blindness, the uncertainty, the long road ahead. Ruth wrote back immediately. She said she wanted to see him, said she didn't care about the injuries, said she wanted to be with him. Pfeiffer read those letters to Schmid. He listened silently. The medication dulled his reactions, made emotions feel distant, unreal. It was hard to believe anyone would still want him. Hard to imagine a future where he was not a burden. In October, Schmid was informed he would receive the Navy Cross. The citation was being drafted. A formal ceremony planned. Johnny Rivers would receive the Navy Cross posthumously. Leroy Diamond would receive his while still recovering from his wounds. The 3 Marines who had held the Tenru machine gun position against nearly 800 Japanese soldiers were being officially recognized for extraordinary heroism. Schmid felt nothing. He had fired because stopping meant death. He had kept firing because the Japanese kept coming. There was nothing noble in it. Nothing heroic. Just survival. Just refusal to quit. A medal could not change the fact that he would never see again. In November, doctors declared him stable enough to travel. The Navy granted medical leave. On January 18, 1943, he arrived home in Philadelphia. He had left 15 months earlier as a healthy steel worker. He returned at 22, blind, scarred, permanently changed. Ruth met him at the train station. He could not see her expression, could not know what crossed her face when she saw the bandages, the scars, the man he had become. She walked straight to him, took his arm, and told him she was there. He had to trust her words. Trust was difficult now. Blindness had taken away his ability to verify the world. Everything depended on others. Philadelphia planned a parade. The city wanted to celebrate its hero. Newspapers had carried the story nationwide. Al Schmid had become a symbol. The parade took place in April. Schmid rode in an open car through streets packed with thousands of people. He could not see the crowd, only hear it. Cheering, shouting his name, celebrating something they did not understand. They saw courage. He remembered terror, pain, darkness. Johnny Rivers dying beside him. On February 18th, Schmid received his Navy Cross at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. An admiral pinned the medal to his uniform while cameras rolled. The citation praised extraordinary heroism, devotion to duty, and decisive contribution to the defense of Henderson Field. The Philadelphia Inquirer awarded him their Hero Prize, $1,000. More attention followed. More interviews. More exhaustion. A writer named Roger Butterfield approached him about a book. Schmid agreed reluctantly. The book, Al Schmid, Marine, was published in 1944. It became a bestseller. Warner Brothers bought the rights. The film would be called Pride of the Marines. Actor John Garfield would play him. Hollywood turned his worst night into entertainment. Schmid could not even watch the film. Through it all, Ruth stayed. She did not leave, did not retreat, did not waver. On April 4th, 1943, they were married. No publicity, no cameras, just family, close friends, and two people choosing to move forward together, blindness, scars, and all. The hardest battle was not the Japanese. It was learning how to live without sight. Blindness was not a single moment of loss. It was thousands of small defeats repeated every day. Learning to walk without seeing obstacles. Learning to pour a glass of water without spilling it. Learning to accept help without feeling diminished by it. Learning to exist in a world built for people who could see. The physical wounds healed. The psychological ones did not. Strangers avoided his face. Some stared too long. Others looked away entirely. Schmid felt their reactions even when he could not see them. Depression came in waves, quiet, persistent, exhausting. He had been independent his entire life. Now every movement required assistance. Every unfamiliar room was a hazard. In 1943 and 1944, surgeons attempted additional procedures on his remaining eye. The goal was modest: restore anything. The operations were partially successful. Schmid regained limited vision. Enough to perceive light and shadow. Enough to distinguish large shapes and movement. Not enough to read. Not enough to recognize faces. Not enough to be independent. But it was something, more than he had expected. In June 1944, Ruth gave birth to their son, Albert Schmid Jr. Schmid held the child in his arms and tried to see him. He could make out the outline of a small body. Movement. Light shifting across skin. But the details, the eyes, the expression, the face, were lost to him. He would never clearly see his own son's face. That knowledge stayed with him. In August 1945, Pride of the Marines was released. The film succeeded not because of the battle scenes. Those took barely 10 minutes of screen time, but because audiences recognized something deeper. The fear, the frustration, the strain on a marriage, the humiliation of needing help, the quiet despair of a man learning to live without sight. It was honest, and it made Schmid famous all over again. He was sent across the country to speak at war bond rallies. City after city, hundreds of speeches, always with Ruth beside him, guiding him to the podium, orienting him to the room, steadying him when fatigue or emotion set in. He could not have done it alone. On December 9, 1944, exactly 3 years after he had enlisted, Schmid was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps. He received a disability pension, modest, but enough. Enough to support Ruth and their son. Enough to begin a civilian life. In 1946, the Democratic Party nominated him for Pennsylvania's Secretary of Internal Affairs. They believed his status as a war hero would carry the election. It did not. Schmid lost. Politics was not his world. He wanted privacy, quiet, a life not defined by speeches and ceremonies. In 1957, the family moved to St. Petersburg, Florida. The warmer climate eased the pain in Schmid's injured leg, an old wound that never fully healed. More importantly, Florida offered anonymity, a place where people did not know his story. There, Schmid learned to fish. He developed techniques that worked despite his limited vision. Ruth described the water, told him where to cast, helped him land fish. They spent long hours together on the water. Fishing became his refuge, a place where silence was not threatening. He also became a ham radio operator. He earned his license, built a station in his home, communicated with people across the world using Morse code and voice. The radio did not care that he was blind, did not care about scars or medals. It only cared whether he knew how to operate it. He did. The radio gave him connection without judgment. Schmid rarely spoke about Guadalcanal. When asked about the Navy Cross, he acknowledged it briefly and moved on. The details of that night belonged to the men who had lived it. Johnny Rivers was dead. Leroy Diamond had gone on with his life. Schmid wanted to do the same. The years passed quietly. The war receded. Fewer people remembered Pride of the Marines. Fewer recognized his name. He preferred it that way. In 1982, Schmid was diagnosed with bone cancer. The disease progressed quickly. Treatment options were limited. On December 1, 1982, Albert Andrew Schmid died at the age of 62. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The Navy Cross was displayed. The flag was folded and handed to Ruth. The ceremony honored a Marine who had done what should have been impossible, a man who had fought blind and held the line.